But welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Charlie Baker. I'm the Executive Director of the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. And we've undertaken this I-89 2050 study that we'll be talking about tonight. And Dave, I guess let's go to the next slide. And yeah, so this obviously is a virtual meeting. So you're coming in, you're muted by default. If you'd like to speak, please click or tap the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen and we'll call on you then. I don't see anyone connected by phone, but you can raise your hand by *9 if you are. And after you've been called on, click or tap the unmute button. So you still need to do that. And there's also another option if you don't want to speak verbally to the group, you can write a question in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Thank you. So here's an outline of the presentation that we're walking through tonight. First, welcome. We're at that stage now. And then I'll kind of give an overview of the whole project and the process that we've gone through over the last couple of years. And then David Saladino will pick it up from the VHB team and review the corridor bundles and the implementation plan. And then I'll grab the mic back and we'll take questions and discussion at the end and talk about next steps. But if you do have questions during the presentation, and we can answer it pretty quickly, we'll do that. If it's a longer conversation, I may ask to come back to that question at the end so we can have a fuller discussion, just to make sure we can get through this. Probably, if no interruptions, it might be 30-ish minutes with some discussions, maybe 40 minutes or longer. So just in case you're planning your time. And here's the project overview. So I'm not going to read all of this, but this is kind of the statement that we started with, collaborating with VTrans, the municipalities and other stakeholders to develop an investment program for the 89 corridor for the next 30 years. We do have a vision, goals, and objective statement, and really trying to identify and prioritize enhancements for the 89 corridor over that time frame. And just a visual, you can see the whole map of Chittenden County on the left. And then we zoomed in because the real issues that we're trying to really address happen in the core of Chittenden County, particularly around the exit 14 interchange. So there you see a zoom in box there. And so this is kind of the beginning of the statement. We've had an advisory committee that has worked with us through this whole process. And these are statements that they developed over the course of a few meetings early on. And of course, pretty early on with this, we went into COVID, right? And so this first statement is just about uncertainty related to COVID, but then also other things are going to change over the next 30 years, technology, demographics, and probably other things that we don't even know about right now. And so we just this statement is to recognize that we're gonna have to reassess things periodically to make sure that we're addressing the evolving situation as best we can. The vision statement talks about the 89 being the interstate system, mainline and interchanges that is safe, resilient, and provides for reliable and efficient movement of people and goods in support of state, regional and municipal plans and goals. And again, we recognize that these vision, goals, and objectives and implementation actions that follow will need to be monitored and reassessed periodically to ensure they address the evolving situation. So again, kind of reinforcing things will change. And then the group came up with 6 goal statements, one addressing safety, one addressing livable and sustainable and healthy communities, one mobility and efficiency, one environmental stewardship and resilience, economic access and vitality, and then system preservation. And these are very similar to our long-range goals as the Regional Planning Commission for the region. Okay. And then to kind of review where we are in the process, you'll see on this graphic, and I know you can't read all the words under these green boxes, so I'll try to give a quick summary here. We started in the summer of 19, kicking off the meeting. That was task 1. The consultant team dug in and looked at current conditions and what we call the future base scenario. We had some focus group meetings at that time and started, tweaking our travel demand model to be as accurate as possible. Then task 3, and this is where we had those meetings to develop the vision and goal statements that I just reviewed. And task 4, and this was a little bit of, we took some time just because the interchanges are such a major component of the system to really dig into evaluating interchange possible improvements. We went through a couple rounds of interchange evaluation. We also looked at possible secondary land use growth. And that's kind of the idea of induced demand. If you add capacity or connections into or interchanges into the system, you may induce some level of land development in that area. And so we spent some time looking at that and spent quite a bit of time at this stage, particularly with South Burlington, because the interchanges that we were focused on, exit 14, 13, and a potential 12B are all within South Burlington city limits. And so I spent quite a bit of time I think that was early in 21, particularly with many meetings with the city to narrow down. And that wasn't making a final decision, but we were trying to narrow the number of interchanges we were looking at. And then task 5, and here we started to get a little broader in terms of looking at corridor improvement bundles. And this was also particularly in response to feedback we got, but also just in response to the situation we're in with regard to climate change, the legislature's Global Warming Solutions Act. We spent a lot more time on transportation demand management and had a focus group that really guided that work. Brought on another consultant, RSG, to develop a strategic model to evaluate transportation demand options. And those options are really things to reduce the demand for driving on the highway network, which means things like buses, bikes, pedestrians working from home, all the things that avoid driving. And then moving on to the implementation plan, which is kind of where we are tonight. We looked at which things are recommended, and then how do we monitor those? What are we measuring? What might be a trigger for moving something forward? And that's really the focus of tonight, is to really look at what has come out of all this work and the implementation plan and how we're going to monitor and trigger, and looking for any feedback you have on that. And then following this, over the summer months, this is really a documentation step. So the consultant team and the project team at the RPC and VTrans will make sure we have everything documented so that we're prepared for next steps down the road. And with that, I will turn it over to David. Thank you. No questions for me. That was good. I got through the easy part.
Right. Good job. Okay. So now we'll get into a little bit more of the details of what has happened in the kind of the last over the last few months as we get towards some recommendations for the corridor. And so Charlie mentioned this term, these corridor bundles, and so just to dig into that a little bit, what are bundles, what went into the bundles. Going to kind of highlight or simplify the process in 3 steps here. First, what we did was to do kind of a full corridor assessment, and we broke this into 2 components. As Charlie alluded to, there was one component that was focused on interchanges, and so we were looking at each of the interchanges within Chittenden County to evaluate their operations, how they could potentially help to address some of the issues within the region. So that was the interchange evaluation. And then secondarily, we also looked at a full kind of comprehensive corridor evaluation. So looking at opportunities to improve safety, technology along the corridor, transit service, high occupancy vehicle lanes, those types of things. So we kind of combined both the interchange, kind of the nodes at the interchanges, looking at that evaluation, and then the corridor itself. And so all of that kind of, once the evaluation was complete and we had gone through kind of a full review with our internal committees and then also with the public, out of that process came these bundles where we pulled certain interchange improvements or certain corridor improvements and put together those bundles to evaluate. And so as we went through that bundle evaluation process, we landed on 5 specific bundles. And so those are shown at the right, on the right here. Lots of acronyms, which subsequent slides will explain kind of what all of those mean. But we have kind of 5 bundles, and of note, they kind of build in, as you go from 1 through 5, they get more and more pieces added to it. So number 1 is kind of the most basic bundle, and then number 4 and 5 are the kind of have the most components. We'll talk about that in a few slides, but that's kind of where we landed with the bundles. And then where we are now is kind of taking those bundles and say, how do we move those into move forward towards implementation with those projects and recommendations. And so that is the implementation plan that will guide this over the next 20 or 30 years, the investments along the corridor. So just to walk through a couple, some details on the 5 bundles. The first one is a 2050 base. So just a reminder, we're looking out, 28 years, so to 2050. And so bundle 1 is basically just our baseline assessment. So that bundle. And so what that includes, so it's essentially the roadway network as it exists today, plus all of the improvements that are included in this 3-year transportation improvement program. So those are projects that are funded within the CCRPC's and VTrans's TIP for the next 3 years, plus all of the investments identified in the CCRPC's ECOS plan. So their long-range metropolitan, the MTP, Metropolitan Transportation Plan. Those are also included. That's what's shown in the map on the right. And so when you add those on top of the existing network, in addition to the MTP also includes some assumptions about growth in the future. So the assumption is that 90% of new residential growth within Chittenden County happens in existing centers. So not necessarily sprawling into the rural areas, but 90% of that is focused in existing centers. The MTP does call for significant bicycle and pedestrian and transit investments, increased participation in transportation demand management programs, and then electrification of 90% of the fleet. So all of that is baked into the bundle 1. So then building from there, so we go bundle 1, so bundle 2. Well, I guess I should note, one of the impetus for this study was really looking at the roadway network, looking out at 2050 with these components in place. During the MTP process, what came out of that evaluation was that there were certain segments of the interstate that were over capacity in 2050. And so this study was really, the impetus for this study was really to evaluate the I-89 corridor to identify ways to address the potential for segments of I-89 to go over capacity over the next 30 years. And so what we see with this 2050 base is that the improvements that are shown on the screen were not sufficient to kind of bend the curve, the growth in travel enough to avoid having to add lanes on the interstate. So doing nothing is not necessarily a long-term solution. And so from there, we build some bundles on top. And the first, as Charlie alluded to, is the idea here is really focusing on non-capacity expansion projects. And so these are transportation demand management measures that are identified and kind of bundled in this bundle 2. So that includes a number of TDM measures, improvements to the sidewalk network, the bike network, expanding transit beyond what the MTP had called for, and significant increase or a continued increase in the telecommute share of commute trips. Charlie alluded to also, we had a TDM focus group that met earlier this year, and through their process, they identified a certain package of investments. The graphic at the bottom shows just a snapshot of the strategic model that RSG had developed, looked at 431 different scenarios, and where we landed was on a scenario that kind of optimized or looked at what bent that curve of vehicle miles traveled. So looking at what combination of investments could best reduce the number of miles that we're driving in Chittenden County. And so that package that they identified, what we were able to estimate is that could reduce the total vehicle miles traveled by up to 20%, which on a slide I'll show that's a very significant reduction in VMT if all of those measures are enacted. So then just moving on, the other three bundles are kind of building again on that bundle two. So bundle three is bundle two. So that's all of the TDM measures plus a reconstruction of exit 14. And what's shown here on the right is a concept sketch for a diverging diamond interchange at exit 14. This came out of the interchange evaluation where we looked at several different interchange configurations. And after going through the technical evaluation and the public discussion, the preference, we landed on this configuration, the diverging diamond interchange for this interchange at exit 14. So then bundle four is that bundle three. So that's all of the TDM measures plus exit 14, the diverging diamond interchange, and then on top of that, a new interchange at the Route 116 overpass of I-89, so also known as exit 12B in South Burlington. So that's just south of Tilley Drive. You can see a concept sketch here on the right. And then similar to bundle four, bundle five is essentially bundle three. So it's all of the TDM measures. It's the exit 14 diverging diamond interchange. And then instead of adding 12B to this bundle, this one adds improvements at the existing exit 13. For those of you who are familiar with exit 13, you know you can't quite get in every direction from the interchange today. So if you're coming up from the south, for example, you can't get to Dorset Street to head to the mall, as an example. Or if you're coming from the south, you also can't get over to Dorset Street. And so this configuration, there was a similar to the exit 12B, there was a number of configurations looked at here at exit 13 through that interchange evaluation. We landed on this single point diamond interchange, an SBDI configuration. So that configuration allows all of the movements to happen at this exit 13, so that regardless of which direction you're coming to this exit, you can go west on 189 or east over to Dorset Street and make your turns onto Dorset Street or continue on to Kennedy Drive. So those are the bundles kind of at a high level. So what we did then was to kind of run those through some analysis, and you can see here there's lots of numbers here on the screen. We won't go through all of the details, but wanted to just hit on some of the kind of things that rose to the top that we saw as we did some evaluation of these different bundles. The columns here in the table are the different bundles, and then the rows are different metrics that we were looking at for each of those bundles. So to start off, what we saw, one thing that's interesting, it's not shown on this table here, but what we saw is that if we don't do anything to improve bicycle pedestrian service, build sidewalks, build bike paths, add transit, encourage telecommuting, if we don't do any of that, the current estimate is that the amount of miles traveled per day is estimated to increase 28% here, as shown, out to 2050. So from about 4.2 million miles up to 5.4 million. So that, just to kind of get a sense of scale here. So that's if we do nothing, VMT increases, and we see lots of things getting overly congested. We see the interstate, the interchanges, all getting congested. If you imagine just today's traffic increasing 28%. And so that's our base, that's our starting point. And so from there, what we see, the improvements that are in the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission's long-range transportation plan. So those improvements reduce our VMT a little bit. So that drops us down by about 4% with those measures in the MTP. And then further, if we do all of the things that are identified in bundle 2, so all of the transportation demand management measures, that gets a significant reduction in VMT. So another 20% reduction, which essentially gets us down to today's VMT level. And so if you can imagine that essentially erases 30 years of growth of travel if we can get all of those bundles implemented. We'll show in a future slide. It's a tall order to get all of these reductions, and we really have to make a really drastic shift to non-motorized measures. But that is an important recommendation from the study, and that is one of the first things that we'll be looking to drive forward towards implementation. And then just the last two things here, just to note the two bundle 4 and 5. So those look at exit 12B and exit 13 as kind of comparing the two. What we see is whether you build 12B or 13, both of them serve to reduce the traffic that's going through exit 14. And that's important. We see, exit 14, that's the main gateway into both South Burlington and Burlington. We've got a lot of traffic that's flowing through there. And so any measures that we can do to reduce the amount of traffic volume through exit 14 is a positive. And so we see here that the exit 13 improvements do reduce the overall traffic through exit 14 a little bit more than exit the 12B, but both of them reduce close to 20 to 25% in both instances. And then similarly, both of those interchanges, if we were to construct one or the other interchange, we also see some significant reductions in traffic volumes on both Wilson Road and Dorset Street. Both of those are nearing capacity today, and so any reduction in traffic volumes on those roadways will kind of help overall operations and safety, and reduce the need to do any capacity expansions on those roadways as well. Okay, so that's kind of in a nutshell. Those are the 5 bundles that we developed. We ran through full evaluation of those. We've run those through both our advisory and technical committees. And before I get to the implementation plan, I see Charlie's got maybe a comment.
No, a question that's in the Q&A asking how common diverging diamond interchanges are, and how do they work for, or how well do they work for biking, walking, etc. And the same question for the single point interchange. So that's from Dale at CLF.
Yep. So the diverging diamond interchange is becoming fairly common interchange configuration. For those of you who aren't familiar, there is one getting ready to go to construction at exit 16 in Colchester. So the Route 2 and 7 interchange will be a diverging diamond interchange. And from a pedestrian and bicyclist standpoint, that was really the driver for choosing this option. As I mentioned, we looked at a couple of different configurations for exit 14, and without getting into specifics on kind of how the DDI works, one of the primary benefits of a DDI is that when you cross the street, you're only ever crossing one direction of traffic at one time. And so you don't have to worry about looking in both directions. You've got kind of shorter distances to cross over. And so one of the real issues that we heard today at exit 14 is just it's not very conducive to walking or cycling across. And so that was really an important consideration when we were looking at different alternatives, and the group felt that the DDI best accommodated those bicycle and pedestrian trips at exit 14. The second half of the question, the single point diamond interchange, those are a little bit less common. There is one, I think the nearest example is in Concord, New Hampshire, right at I think it's at Route 3 in Concord. So that's an example of a single point diamond interchange. Those are a little bit less common, but unlike a DDI where you're actually crossing over onto the other side of the traffic, which will take a little bit of getting used to, this single point diamond interchange, I think from a driver's perspective, you're basically just getting off and coming to a traffic light and then making your movements. So while the configure, from the aerial view, it might look a little bit different. I think from a driver's perspective, this will just look like a standard intersection where they get off and see a traffic light and make their movements from there.
Dave, there's one more, I guess more of a comment in the Q&A about having a park and ride at each interchange has been identified as facilitating carpooling, use of buses, and mixed mode travel. I don't see planning for a park and ride at each interchange.
Wait a few slides and we will talk about it. So that is one of the recommendations for sure in the plan.
Thanks.
Okay, so we've gone through the bundles, and then kind of the next step is then how do we move the project or the elements from each of the bundles forward towards implementation? And so that is the implementation plan is kind of what describes that process to move projects forward. And unlike many standard, for those of you who've been involved in other transportation planning efforts, things like this typically end with a preferred alternative. Here's what we're going to build, and here's how we're going to implement that one specific recommendation. In this case, we're looking at 30 years. It's a very complex corridor. There's lots of unknowns. And so we've taken taken the opportunity to utilize the implementation plan here to really help articulate the timing and which projects move forward at what time, given all of the unknowns that we're facing today. And so, as noted here, this implementation plan provides that framework for each of the recommendations, and we'll go through those in a few slides. The plan identifies the things noted here. So a description of the project, the time frame, what metrics or triggers would be needed to be met before implementing that project, how much the project would cost, who's in charge, or who would be leading or partnering on the implementation, and then what are the next steps. And so just on the side here, this is an example, one of the recommendations. Anyone who's been off, in the exit 14 area, we're looking at, we've got the CVS in the background. This is getting off northbound 89. We've got two traffic signals fairly close. You've got the signal as you get off the ramp, and then you've got the Williston and Dorset Street. The signals are very close, and that often causes some confusion and queuing backing up through the signals. So this is one of those recommendations, just as an example. So relocating that signal away from Dorset Street, you can see here the trigger, the cost estimate, and who would be in charge of implementing that. So that's kind of how the plan works. And then also, as we mentioned before, this implementation plan, because of the unknowns, not just COVID, but autonomous vehicles and other technologies and other kind of unknowns as we look out 30 years, really felt it was important to have a committee to help to evaluate trends as we go forward each year. Oops. So we'll walk through. So we've got we kind of bucketed each of the recommendations into three timeframes. So we have a short and a medium and a long. So short is over the next 1 to 5 years. First thing right out of the gates is to convene that corridor monitoring committee. So we will want them to meet on a regular basis to review the data and the triggers. Secondly, as we've noted several times on the previous slides, these transportation demand management measures, the TDM measures, we've identified what they are. And so these sub-bullets here. So increasing the amount of teleworking by 50%, doubling trips made by bicycle, tripling transit service and improving frequencies, doubling participation in TDM programs, looking at cost of parking, increasing that, and then mileage-based user fee. Those are some fairly significant measures. And so those have been identified, and those are the components that can get us that 20% reduction in VMT, which is a significant reduction, but they're also significant measures that we'll really have to take a lot of effort to identify how to get these enacted. And so while we've identified these bullets, this recommendation, that's the second bullet here, is to develop the plan. How do we advance each of these individual measures? So that's the second bullet. The third bullet is to take the exit 14 evaluation to the next step. We showed the DDI on the previous slide. That was a very kind of high level conceptual sketch, but moving that forward, all are in agreement that that's an important improvement for the interstate corridor. So moving that into kind of the next phase of scoping, public outreach, and design. And then the next two are kind of monitoring things. So monitoring both the electric vehicle market penetration as we start to see the ramp up of EV vehicles and charging stations. And then looking at, as the state of Vermont, as other states are looking at implementing a mileage-based user fee. So right now, gas vehicles are paying their gas taxes when they fill up their gas tanks, but electric vehicles not necessarily. And so there's discussions of a mileage-based user fee for those electric vehicles, so implementing that. And then this last one is a small one, just putting on some traffic count loops on the interchange ramps so we can better monitor traffic volumes in real time on the interchange.
So Dave, we got a couple of questions in the Q&A, but one is quick about the TDM measures here. What was the baseline for the TDM measures? Like when you say increase telework by 50%, 50% compared to what? Or doubling bike or tripling transit?
Mm-hmm. Those are all based, well, the bicycle and transit are based on today's mode share. So based on today, who's right, how many trips are being made by bicycle, how many are being made by transit. So those are increases over today. The teleworking is a little bit more nuanced, and it's essentially the telework share. Obviously, with the COVID pandemic, we saw lots of people working from home. Teleworking was very high, a high percentage of the commute trips. As the pandemic has started to ebb and we've seen people go back to work, that number has gone down. And so the 50% is really an increase over and above what the high watermark was at the height of the pandemic. So it is a fairly significant share of telework trips, which I think underscores the importance of really making sure we've got lots of partners and the right people around the table to talk about how to implement these, because we'll need to have employers involved. We'll need to have multiple parties involved to help make sure that this happens.
And did you want to address the park and ride question at this time, or?
That's on the next slide.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yep.
Thanks.
Good segue though. So if we move the implementation plan, the last slide was the 1 to 5 years. This is medium term, so 6 to 15 years. First one are the variable or changeable message boards. So those are the signs out that you'll see on the interstate. Sometimes they have fun messages, or sometimes they warn you about weather events. The goal for VTrans is to have those in both directions between each interchange within the Chittenden County limits. And so that's there's actually those. I think we'll start to see those coming, as soon as maybe even this summer or next summer. There have been a number of them that are on their way to Chittenden County. So we'll start to see more of those. And so those can activate if there's an accident or an incident to help direct people around traffic. So that's a really important measure, as well as weather and other incident management. So the next bullet is actually implementing that TDM plan. So the previous slide showed coming up with, who are the partners, what are the steps needed to get, a tripling of transit or a doubling of bike trips. This bullet is really investing in those improvements. So that's, adding new buses to the network, building new bike paths, those types of things. So that's this implementation bullet here. The third one is around interchange ramp geometrics. So first off, at exit 14, what we see, the first sub bullet, so reducing the radii at the ramps. And so right now, the exit 14 is a cloverleaf interchange, and so it's really built for speed and built for automobiles. And so as you enter and exit each of the ramps, they're very kind of high speed movements. So you're not really slowing down as you're going through the interchange today, which is great for automobiles, but not so great for pedestrians and cyclists who are trying to cross those ramp entrances and exits. And so that first recommendation, and all of this is kind of pending the results of the bullet that was on the previous slide, to look at exit 14 to confirm what is the right future solution. So once we have that study complete, then looking at potentially reducing those radiuses at each of those enter and exit points to slow down, to force the vehicles to slow down as they're entering those ramps, so that if there are pedestrians or cyclists crossing at the existing crosswalks, they're moving more slowly. So that's that first bullet. The second kind of sub bullet is to relocate the exit 14 northbound ramp. That was shown in the photo on the previous slide. What's shown here on the right is kind of a concept sketch showing again that shifting of the northbound off ramp west a bit away from Dorset Street to provide a little bit extra space there for the queuing and vehicle movements. And then we get to the second to last bullet here. This is constructing additional park and rides and transit intercept facilities. The CCRPC is leading a study looking at park and rides throughout the region right now. And so implementing the recommendations that come out of that plan falls here in the medium term. And then this last one here, gets at the question. So if you recall a few slides ago, we had our bundles 4 and 5 had, bundle 4 had exit 12B, bundle 5 had exit 13. And this last bullet really gets at which of those two are the better solution to address the issues at the time. And it's really important to note here, in italics, if the triggers are met. And so this gets back to the whole idea of monitoring this corridor. This next phase of work to look at these two interchanges would not get triggered unless certain conditions are met on the interchange. And so those conditions, as we've identified here, are shown here in the blue box to the right. And so before initiating kind of that next phase, looking at 12B and 13, which here environmental impact statement is kind of the vehicle to take that to the next level. Before doing that, what we've stipulated here is that the monitoring committee, as they meet periodically, they'll be looking at, first off, is the TDM evaluation complete? Is the exit 14 scoping study complete? Is the number 3, is the Wilson Road and Dorset Street intersection over capacity for over 2 hours? There's that's kind of a critical component. And so even though we're talking about exit 12B and 13, which are a bit removed from the Wilson Road and Dorset Street intersection, what we see is that that's kind of a nexus of a lot of things in the region. So we've got obviously lots of planned growth in South Burlington. We've got the University Mall, City Center, got a planned city street coming into Dorset Street. And the intersection itself is just about built out as much as it can from a capacity standpoint. So it can't really handle too much more traffic. And so what the idea here is that in it, exit 12B and 13 can enhance other things as well. But I think what we felt that the tie to conditions at Wilson Road and Dorset Street, which is close to capacity today, the benefits that both 12B and 13 have to take traffic out of this intersection is really the main driver for looking at 12B and 13, so that we're not looking at finding ways to expand the Wilson Dorset Street intersection even bigger than it is today.
And Dave, I'm sorry, two things I want to, if you could back up, just a park and ride thing. We kind of note that the regional park and ride study plan is underway, but I just also want to note for the record that exit 12 park and ride, I think I just saw them starting to do some clearing at south of exit 12. So yeah, that project is just getting underway. Park and ride just got built a couple of years ago at exit 16. There's also been a study to look at putting one at exit 17. And I anticipate, our regional park and ride study that's underway is probably going to have us looking at, what is there a possibility of something at exit 14 or also on like Shelburne Road before you get to 189. And amongst others. I don't mean that to be comprehensive, but I just want to give a little bit more color. There's more going on than just a study. For Ian, who asked about the park and ride efforts. And then we got a question about, is 12B a done deal? And I'm responding in writing also in the Q&A. But the short answer to that is no, period. But what we're indicating to you tonight is we'll keep monitoring conditions in the corridor, and this is what Dave was just reviewing. And depending on how things look, and we review it with that corridor monitoring committee, we may initiate with VTrans, and this is really, VTrans will be the lead at this point, an environmental impact statement to evaluate if 12B or 13 makes sense, or do nothing, which is always an option when you do an EIS. So it is not a done deal in either direction. It's neither not going to happen or definitely going to happen. We don't know is really the correct answer, but this is kind of a commitment to monitoring the situation. And at the appropriate time, if it looks like it's the appropriate time based on at least these initial measures or triggers that Dave just reviewed, then we might start that EIS process to look at whether we should do one or another of those interchanges or nothing.
Okay.
Was that fairly accurate, Dave?
Yeah, no, that's spot on. Yep. Okay. We're just about at the finish line here. So the last piece here are the long-term actions. So we have two here in the 15+ years.
Oh, Dave, before you get going on this, I got one more little technical question. Dale's asking about the what is VC ratio of 0.9? Like, what does that really mean for a driver? What does that feel like?
That's a very good question, and something I just glossed over. It essentially means that it's volume to capacity. So VRC is the volume to capacity. So it's basically the ratio. What I like to do is think of it as a pipe. So if the road was a pipe, that means it's 90% full. So the 0.9, and as we get close to 1, that pipe is completely full. And then you start to see really long backups. And, typically as a traffic engineer, we tend to look at that 0.9 or 90% full as kind of that break point at which point things start to kind of fall apart, or we start to see excess delays and so forth. And so that's kind of a common threshold. So that's what we would be monitoring. So when does this intersection get to be 90% full, essentially? Okay, so just to wrap up here, long term, the midterm, we had a couple of kind of quick hitting interchange ramp improvements. There's two specific ramps that we're calling out that for long-term actions because they involve bridge widening. One example here, one of the two is at exit 11 in Richmond. If you can see on the right here, the white line, so existing acceleration length. So if you're coming, if you're coming out of Richmond and you're heading towards Burlington, you've got 630 feet to accelerate. Based on current guidance today, you should have about 1,200 feet to accelerate. I believe when the interstate was originally constructed, this was a little bit short because there's that second bridge that what's highlighted in the light blue here over the railroad and the Verberg Lane. And so this is just an example where ideally we would have 1,200 feet, an opportunity to accelerate fully up to 65 miles an hour. We don't have that today, so that's a specific example. It would require a new bridge, so that's a fairly expensive. I think we're in the $10 to $15 million improvements here to improve that. So thus it lands in the long-term actions. And then lastly, what we've kind of held out here is looking at potentially widening the interstate. And so this is in the event that there is a need for a third lane on any particular segment. And again, the caveat here is if these triggers are met. And so on the right here, we're showing what those triggers are. So the first trigger is the volume. So a segment, the average annual daily traffic volume, so AADT. So if we see that trending above 70,000 cars per day over the next 15 years, that would be one trigger. Just as a basis of comparison, we're at about 50 to 52,000 today on kind of between exit 14 and 15. So over the bridge, over the Winooski River, we're in the 50,000-ish range. So still some room left before we get to that kind of overcapacity situation. Similar to the Wilson and Dorset Street intersection, we're also looking at kind of thinking of this as a pipe. And so if this pipe gets to be over 90% full for more than 2 hours over the next 15 years, that would be another trigger. Then if we see certain if crashes exceed a certain rate, this critical crash rate, that would be a third trigger. And then the final trigger is travel time reliability. And so this is really a metric of, if you drive 89 as part of your daily commute and it takes you 20 minutes to get to work each day, the reliability is that that in general, it's going to take you, maybe 25 minutes one day to 18 minutes the next day. That's your reliability. If things start to get over capacity and you start to see, congestion on certain days, then your trip may become 30 minutes some days or 35 minutes some days, and then 18 minutes the next day. And that's when that's the reliability piece. And when that starts to kind of fluctuate, drivers tend to get frustrated. And so this is something that V-Trans monitors every year. We're well above that kind of the 90% threshold. But if that were ever to drop below 90%, that would be the fourth trigger for the new lane. So then just to kind of bring it all home here for the kind of monitoring process. As we've mentioned a couple times, given the unknowns, we've got this kind of piece in here to monitor and reassess the data, and that will be led by this monitoring committee. And they'll be looking at a number of different things. So how well has the TDM measures been implemented? What are traffic volumes looking like? Is that curve starting to bend because we are starting to see more people shift onto buses or bikes or walking? How are crashes looking? What are those reliability metrics? And then mode shifts. So how many people, what percentage of trips are being made in cars versus bus versus bike versus on foot? And so at those regular meetings, they'll have the data to review, and then they'll be evaluating those against the identified triggers to see if if any of the triggers are met. And if they are, this monitoring committee would then advise V-Trans to consider moving forward with one of those recommendations. So I think with that, I will pass it back to Charlie.
Yeah, so sorry, Dave, I've had one question that's been hanging here for a while about commercial traffic and whether we study that, particularly tractor trailers, and which options would be best to reduce traffic through residential areas.
We did not look at that specifically. And the focus of the study and the evaluation was really on the interstate corridor. And to the extent that some of the new interchange, the new interchange at 12B or the enhanced configuration of 13, I would say those both do draw some traffic, both commercial vehicles and automobiles off of some of the side streets because they can access the interstate more easily. So I would say one of those, but we didn't look specifically at commercial vehicles or really on neighborhood streets what the impacts would be.
Yeah, thanks, David. Another question, which I'm not sure you know the answer to this one, but will the exit 11 park and ride ever be equipped with fast DC chargers to encourage electric vehicle use? And
I would be surprised if it's not. I think VTrans's goal is to have an EV charging station at every interchange, and so that would seem like a logical spot at exit 11.
yeah, and I was just to supplement what Dave just said. I think the legislature has tasked VTrans with really looking at where charging stations are located. And I agree with Dave. I would be surprised if that wasn't one of the locations to get EV charging stations set up there.
Yeah.
And then Karen Yakos is asking, can we in Vermont decide to adjust the triggers to represent something other than ease of driving? How would that be done? And that's a good, yeah, I'm sorry that's not kind of coming across as Dave looked at, individual triggers for different pieces, Karen. But I think a big part of the monitoring program is really monitoring the TDM efforts. And so, yes, we can definitely adjust the triggers. I think, the Corridor Monitoring Committee and VTrans and CCRPC, as they meet over time, we'll probably have that discussion, like, something else is going on, we should monitor X that we're not monitoring. So we can certainly adjust the triggers or even, change the threshold, right? Maybe it's not 0.9, maybe it's 0.95 or right. So I think we're trying to communicate a system that is flexible and can adapt to what is an unknown future. I kind of early on talked about, whether it's a pandemic or technology, autonomous cars, climate change, there's a lot of unknowns in our future. So I think we're intending for this implementation plan to be a living effort, if you will, not a document, but an actual living effort that does adapt as we learn more things over time. And again, I think, the big focus early on is going to be on that TDM work and how fast and far those things can be implemented to reduce the need for any of those capacity improvements. And that that is the big issue in front of us, not just related to this study, frankly, but you're related to just the transportation system, climate change, or the transportation contributions to climate change in front of us. So there's a lot more there. I hope that is a helpful answer. I don't know, David, anything you wanted to add to that?
I thought that was good.
So okay, well, you guys were not too hard on us with too many questions coming too fast. I believe I got to every question and answered it either verbally in the session, or there were a couple that I was able to answer in writing in the Q&A. Let me know if there's anything missing there. I see Dale has her hand up. Dale?
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I just I wanted to offer a comment because this is the first that I've seen of the specific triggers for starting that EIS for adding lanes to the highway. And
Yeah.
I just wanted to offer a comment that, I think in some ways, if we have that level of traffic, it actually offers opportunities because it means that there would be demand for a really robust public transportation system. And so I actually think that in some ways, like those traffic thresholds could be seen as indicating that the TDM triggers or the TDM goals aren't high enough, so that maybe tripling transit as a mode share, if we've got that many people driving on the interstate, we ought to have plenty of people who would like to be using some better form of transportation than their own car. Just wanted to offer that as a comment.
Yeah, and Dale, it's a good point. And I think if I could just put a twist on what you just said. Well, I have two thoughts. One is if there is that much of an increase in driving on the interstate, that means that the TDM efforts have not been fully implemented and or embraced by the public. And so I think that is the big fork in the road, so if I can use that analogy. Is TDM embraced and used? And to your point, if there's that many more people that could potentially get to that many more drivers, are they able to use a bus instead? And if they're not using the bus, are there ways to induce that change in behavior? So that is a question. And the bigger point I wanted to make, the second point, is we really had some good internal debate about whether to even include that widening thing in here as part of the implementation. Like, is it really a recommendation or not? Because I think based on what we know today, we're of the belief that it's not likely that we ever get to that point, especially if we're successful in implementing those TDM strategies. And so it's there, but it's way down the road. Sorry to use that analogy, way down the tracks, maybe I'll say. And so I don't want anybody to walk away out of this meeting saying, oh, they're planning to widen the interstate. That is not at all the message you should be taking away from what we're saying. It's that, if everything else goes wrong, and, I guess there was one scenario when we were doing our long range transportation plan that is stuck in my head, which was, what is the future of autonomous vehicles? And there's one that's like a shared autonomous vehicle future, like, oh, there's a car coming by and I can hop in, kind of like almost transit on demand or carpooling on demand type of thing through apps, right? Uber rideshare, Lyft rideshare type things. That's not so bad, but there is a bad scenario with autonomous vehicles, which is that it takes people to their destinations and then empty cars go back on the highway network to, go to a parking lot or go back to your house, or, so I think there are potential futures out there that
basically move forward with implementation starting next year and the years to come. The final report will be done in the summer of 2022 sometime. Hopefully by July, we should be finishing everything up, and everything is going to be on the website. And I think that's the last slide, Dave.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, so I can see if anybody has a question or a raised hand. Does anybody?
We do not have any more open questions or hand raises.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you all so very much for participating and providing, again, comments and asking questions. And just be in touch if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for picking that up, Eleni. And
Sure.
yeah, and if you have a group or anybody that you'd like us to follow up with and get into a little bit more detail, happy to do a deeper dive with anybody. Let us know. Yeah, thank you all very much. And wow, I didn't anticipate being done by 7 o'clock. So is anybody having a good barbecue? I have an hour free tonight, so yeah, that's a joke. I'm good.
Enjoy the evening.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Have a good night.